Welcome back to Tocqueville Talks. I'm Brent Nelsen, director of the Tocqueville Center for the Study of Democracy and Society here at Furman University. And Beth is with me as usual. Good day today, huh?
It is. It's a great day. We've got the third of our series from the globalism event.
Yeah. Scott Lincicome. He is at the Cato Institute. He is actually a lawyer by trade. He was a trade lawyer, so I guess.
A trade lawyer by trade.
And he really learned about trade by being involved in these kinds of lawsuits that go on when companies think that governments have broken their promises or other companies are undercutting their one other company's prices. So he learned a lot about that, and he is now been at Cato for quite a while now. And he's on the libertarian side. He's much more free market oriented and pro-globalization. So really interesting conversation. Scott's high energy.
Yeah, he broke down what, in his view, are the real trade-offs behind the tariffs and why industrial policy and globalization, has operated the way it has, and what are the benefits of that, continuing in that direction. And once again, talks about the things affecting our, regular people, including students right now, rising cost of living, job options, long-term economic mobility. And we look at the question, which was also shared by Tocqueville, of in a system shaped by global markets and large institutions, what does it mean to remain economically independent? So,
yeah, those are difficult questions, but again, a really good interview. Let's go to that right now. Here's Beth.
Okay, so welcome, Scott Lincicome.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, we're excited to have you here at the Tocqueville Center. And I wanted to start off just by getting a sense of what first convinced you that open markets were worth defending. And was there ever a moment that you thought the critics of globalization might have a point?
Well, I think the critics do have points, but I think they're swamped by the good that is the benefits of globalization. And I think they can often be disconnected from the political realities of managed trade, tariffs, and other policies. Because really, a lot of my support for open trade and open markets and economic freedom is pragmatic. I spent almost 2 decades practicing international trade law and toiling with the Commerce Department and dealing with anti-dumping cases and all of this very boring stuff. And I saw how the sausage is actually made. And I saw that trade and tariff policy and fair trade policy was not guided by enlightened technocrats and was not perfect policy that maybe is discussed oftentimes when people talk about protectionism. It was really bureaucratic and very imprecise and very much captured by politics and not economics. And that, combined with basic libertarian sensibilities, made me realize that for the good intentions that I think a lot of people who are globalization skeptics have, and for even some of their valid criticisms, you have to always filter that through the political realities of our American political system, of the bureaucracy, and of the rest. And once you do that, there's just not much of a case for big, broad actions. And instead, you need to stay humble, skeptical, and where you do get involved, it's pretty narrow.
Well, speaking of one of those angles that we hear the big, broad sort of policy decisiveness coming down is this idea that tariffs are going to be protecting jobs. And so a lot of people are talking about them. And they also hear, well, you're going to have tariffs, but then you're going to have higher prices. But if you had to explain it simply, for an undergraduate level, what would you say in terms of the implementability, I guess, of these policies, taking off of what you were already saying, not very implementable, possibly. And then in terms of who actually wins and who actually loses.
Yeah, I think the easiest way to think about it is that a tariff is a 19th century policy applied in a 21st century economy. The reality is that about half of everything imported in the United States today are capital goods, equipment, and other stuff used by American manufacturers to make other things. So tariffs not only raise the price of the stuff we buy at Walmart, but they raise the prices for American manufacturers. And so that's why you haven't seen this explosion in American manufacturing over the last year where we've had historic tariffs, because when you put tariffs on steel, well, then suddenly the automakers have higher costs. They're less competitive. They hire fewer people because they have less money to spend on hiring. So that, along with the uncertainty of all of it, investors love to know what's next. They can deal with a higher tax if they know if it's going to be there for 10 years, because that's how they invest. When you build a factory or any other type of investment, you need a nice long time horizon, maybe 30 years. If you don't know what tariff policy is going to be next month or even next week, you're not going to invest. So we've actually seen over the last year a lot of hesitation in the market because nobody knows what's going to happen. And that's the nature of these types of interventions, because they're not permanent legislated policy. They're policy made by unilateral executive action by just the president. All these tariffs are just by President Trump. But also, our political system in the United States changes every 2, 4, 6 years. You go from a Trump to a Biden and back to Trump. And so these policies are inevitably unstable, and that makes it very difficult to implement. And this, I think goes back to what I was saying before. This is not we're not implementing policy in a lab. We're implementing it in the real world, and that makes it very difficult for the policy to have the effects that maybe economists might say would have in that laboratory. And then the last thing, another way politics gets involved is the minute you apply a tariff, everybody runs to Washington for two things. They either want their own tariffs or they want exemptions. And we've seen a ton of carve-outs over the last year because Apple needed a carve-out for smartphones, or you needed carve-outs for semiconductors that are used in data centers, or President Trump's feeling some political pressure, so he eliminates tariffs on beef and food products. So all of a sudden, again, this kind of blanket tariff policy becomes Swiss cheese tariff policy because the lobbyists got a hold of it.
Has there been a governmental policy in your experience in being involved in this that actually has been successful? Yeah. And does it fall into like a certain type?
Sure. Typically, the policies that do work are ones that are durable, so they're legislated, they're permanent. Okay. And second, it's ones that simply let actors, investors, CEOs do what they really wanted to do in the first place, but maybe were constrained by higher costs or really long timelines. So we've seen success with corporate tax reform, where simply lowering the cost for manufacturers and others to invest, that actually has increased investment. And it was done permanently. Right? Our corporate tax reforms were not unilateral action. That was a permanent change of the tax code. That can be good. We've seen some good stuff on trade, where when we lowered tariffs, we did it permanently. And that, again, allows companies the ability to invest over that long term. And they wanted to, whether it's build a factory or hire, but they needed that certainty to do so. We're seeing some good stuff on permitting reform today. Again, not getting rid of environmental regulations, but streamlining them, because it could take 4, 5, 6 years to build a plant out, for semiconductors or whatever. Just simply truncating that has also improved the investment climate as well. So in general, they're permanent, and they're more about getting the government not entirely out of the way, but making things more predictable and easier to do business here.
Okay, so do you see, is there, as like from the libertarian perspective, you're coming from obviously somebody that has, not just a theoretical perspective. Yeah. Are there any of the libertarian type theorists, though, that you would say are sort of have hooked in most closely to how the actual reality works, or are most useful?
Well, gosh, I mean, honestly, these days it's amazing how much philosophers like Ayn Rand and, of course, economists like Friedrich Hayek, actually, it still is highly relevant today. When you think about when Hayek talks about the knowledge problem for industrial policy, right, that it's very, very difficult for people in Washington to pick winners and losers, to figure out what's the next best technology. We're seeing that right now. American consumers turned out not to be nearly as excited about electric vehicles as the government was. And now you have stranded assets, empty battery factories, because not only did policy change, but also just consumer interest wasn't the same. And so that is classic Hayekian lesson. And then on the RAND side, look, the amount of lobbying that has occurred because of the tariffs, lobbying has skyrocketed. And so you've really seen, how political actors get involved in the business community or in economic policy as well. And it does conjure up some of those images. Rand's kind of pretty heavy-handed on that stuff, but there are some parallels.
So kind of to the other extreme of this, I guess I'm thinking in terms of like corporations that have freedom to the degree of, getting the evil monopoly or some such thing. And then you have the necessity that kind of accompanies that of like, you need some bigger entity that's going to come in and, oppose that somehow. So you have this like constant tug of war, or I don't know, like mutually enforcing ballooning. I don't know what to call it. I'm sure there's like some technical word for it, but where you have corporations that are exercising freedom and operating in the free market, but situations where it seems like some kind of regulation is needed to come and step in, and because of like the size of the economies now, like and the global economy now, it's like who can regulate? Who could possibly regulate? And so just like your thoughts generally on that, but also specifically, what is the place of government regulation specifically? And has there been a failure to, like, do we need more regulation, or has there just been a failure to, like, implement antitrust?
Right. So I think when you talk about regulation, you need to keep two things in mind. One is that in a lot of cases, and I think in the vast majority of cases, the market is a fantastic regulator, especially today with things like Yelp reviews and the kind of proliferation of this kind of bottom-up commenting and a system thanks to the internet. A lot of what companies might have been able to get away with decades ago is very difficult, particularly where you have easy or low barriers to entry so the competitors can come in. Because if a company swoops in, takes out its competition, jacks up prices, well, that creates an opportunity for a new market entrant to swoop in and steal that business. So both from competitor companies and consumers, you can do a lot of stuff that in the market can do a lot of the regulating. That's the first thing. The second is you always have to be worried with regulation about capture. And that is that the biggest companies very often like to use regulation as a moat. They like to keep their competitors out. Facebook, for example, often has argued to put restrictions on Section 230, which allows for kind of free speech on the internet. And so you have to worry that when regulation occurs, it's not actually being done in the public interest. It's being done to benefit the biggest companies at the expense of the little guys. And, frankly, you actually see this in tariff policy. Ford, GM, Apple, and others were able to lobby for their own carve-outs. The little guys, including manufacturers, they're not getting those exemptions. And you see the same thing in the regulatory space. Now, that doesn't say that we shouldn't have any regulation. Environmental regulation is actually a clear area where there's a pretty good case for there being a market failure for, say, pollution, and you need some sort of a non-market regulatory device. So then you have to start really getting into the weeds of what kind of regulation, how do you keep it simple and transparent, how do you prevent capture and those kind of things. But those are really edge cases. In the vast majority of cases, the market's pretty darn good at that. And you have to be worried a lot about the government doing the company's bidding instead of what's best for the public.
Like wink, wink, nudge, nudge. I have a lawyer here who will help you write your regulations so
Correct.
that this thing will never happen again that we just did.
Exactly. And you always have to remember, big companies have armies of lawyers and accountants and lobbyists. They can afford big government. The little guys who's a sole proprietor with a great idea, he doesn't have a chance. And, we're even seeing it right now with tariff refunds. So the president's emergency tariffs last year were ruled illegal by the Supreme Court, and now they're offering refunds. But the big companies, they're in court, and they have these really complex systems to get their money back. And we're talking billions of dollars. The smallest importers have none of that. And so we could end up with a situation where giant firms are getting big fat refunds and the little guys are owed just tens of thousands of dollars by the government, but they'd have to pay $30,000 in lawyers, so they end up getting nothing.
Well, to continue a little bit with these big guys, the giants, the giant corporations, and to connect it to Tocqueville kind of explicitly, Tocqueville obviously thought that democracy depends on citizens who can act independently and shape their own lives and have that kind of control at the local level. But that control actually radiates outwards, throughout the entire system. And today, we have massive firms, global supply chains, digital platforms that we're dealing with, these giants, incomprehensible. And even in an open market system, I'm kind of wondering, how much agency do you think individuals really have? And what's one concrete way that we could preserve or increase our independence when a system is just this large and overwhelming?
Well, on the private market side, there is an issue with network effects, right? You really get hooked on your Apple ecosystem and you stay in that space. So, part of it is to be open to moving on from whether it's your bank or your smartphone or whatever, because that acts as a check on corporate action. Fortunately, we still have in the United States a very open market in most areas. We have a lot of choice, and exercising that choice is actually a way to push back against corporate power if you're concerned about those things. When I change my cable company to Hulu or whatever, they're offering me a better deal, right? Well, that happens a lot, and keeping open, staying open to that, embracing that change is a good thing. On the government side, not to be rather trite, but education and engagement. I think the biggest problem we have in politics today is just the disengagement. So few people really know or care about this stuff. And the reality is, our system of government is designed to have a lot of local control, and local controls so that we can go down the street and talk to the guy who's involved in school policy, or we care about these issues, so we live them every day. As things get more and more centralized in Washington, and as people pay less and less attention, that allows the government to get away with a lot more. And I don't really mean that in nefarious ways, but it's just the kind of nature of the beast. Lobbying and politics, when our big life decisions are being set in Washington, and you don't live in Washington, and it's complicated, and suddenly just shrug your shoulders and go back to social media. And so a lot of that is to decentralize and but also stay engaged with what is going on out there in the government.
All right. Well, I think that's a perfect place to stop. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Thanks for listening to Tocqueville Talks. This episode was produced by Audrey Enghauser. Lucy Southwell provided administrative support. The theme music is called The Girl I Left Behind Me, a popular folk song in early 19th century America, here performed by Jacob Taylor Armerding. To learn more about our lecture series and events, our Tocqueville and Beaumont Fellows programs for undergraduates, and to listen to episodes, watch event recordings, or support our work, search on Google for the Tocqueville Center at Furman University. If you enjoyed the episode, please like, subscribe, comment, and share Tocqueville Talks on all your favorite listening services. And visit our YouTube channel for full recordings of past events and episodes. Until next time, goodbye.